the subject of corruption, and specifically the effect of corruption on development understood broadly, and the gender aspects in that fight. There is a sense in which what I'm going to say is not new. The subject of corruption is one which Africa discusses on a daily basis. In the last few years, every other African politician seeking public office does so on the platform of eradicating corruption. Every other pronouncement that is made by African political leaders is made on the basis that if corruption is eliminated, then Africa will realize our potential. On the eve of the 21st century, it was stated by both Afro-pessimists and Afro-optimists that the 21st century would be Africa's century. 17 years later, Africa still continues to punch below her weight, politically, economically, and otherwise. We talk about the existence of instruments which have been ratified by African countries. When the international community met in Merida in Mexico in the year 2003, the African countries were the very first to sign and ratify. And I want to submit to you tongue-in-cheek that African countries are in the business of signing everything on sight. But on many occasions, they don't intend to implement what they sign. Subsequently, of course, or a little much earlier, in this very city of Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, the African leaders once again, recognizing that corruption was an impediment to socio-economic and political development, drafted and gave unto us the African Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption. Once again, tongue-in-cheek, Africa has this penchant for giving long names to instruments as if that were the solution. But you and me know that corruption is alive and well, purporting to ride on the crest of those two instruments. Several African regions, SADC, East African Community, and ECOWAS, came up with their own protocols and, of course, domesticated these pieces of convention into domestic law and created institutions which are designed to fight corruption. So that when you talk about the fight against corruption in Africa, the law is innocent. We have enough laws. When you talk about corruption in Africa, the institutions are innocent. We have enough institutions. When you talk about awareness, people know that corruption is a bad thing. In fact, if you look at many of the pieces of legislation, we say that one of the things we do in our fight against corruption is to educate the people. So we go about, and my good friend from Liberia said that one of the ways in which you deal with corruption is to have the civil society in the fight against corruption. I disagree with him. That is not the solution. That is not the only solution, and I'll demonstrate very shortly why that is not the only solution. We thought that if we give more resources to these institutions, then that is the solution. Once again, it appears that that is not the solution. And there is a sense, therefore, in which we must ask very simple and foundational questions. Why is it that a continent and a people who recognize that corruption undermines their very being continues to engage in corruption? If corruption is a cancer, and we know that one of the ways of dealing with cancer is to administer chemotherapy, why do we continue to take aspirin in the belief that it will cure the cancer? These are the questions that we must pose to ourselves. And I'm saying, therefore, that there is nothing new that we will say about the impact of corruption on development in Africa. We are a continent of 1.5 billion, even more. The Nigerians have refused to conduct a census. If they did, Your Excellency, perhaps you could be a few more millions. As the Ethiopians and many other countries, I say that in jest. And yet our economy combined, all the 54 countries, or 55, depending on which one you are excluding, if it is Saharaui, our constitution combined is smaller. Our economies combined is smaller than the economy of Spain. Why? You and me know that as we speak now, I'm giving the reasons why corruption leads to underdevelopment. How many wars of different kinds are alive and well in Africa? You cannot have a government in Somalia, you cannot have one in Central African Republic. You have one that is tottering in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a tottering one in South Sudan, a tottering one in different African countries. And these are breeding grounds for corruption. We have countries where unemployment is anything between 80 and 90%. We have countries where young men and women are running away to go to be enslaved, willingly or unwillingly, in Europe. We have leaders who will assemble here later this month, and they will reiterate that this is the year that we have designated for the fight against corruption. I hope I am wrong, but it will yet be just another declaration. On the 31st day of December 2018, if we do nothing, nothing will have changed. Why? Because there is something that must be wrong with us. I like the presentation that was made there, that it must begin with us. I listened to my good friend from my country in Kenya, who lamented about religion. We are the most religious individuals on earth. If we are Muslims, we pray 5 times a day. If we are Christians, we are praying on Saturdays and Sundays. But we are unmoved and untouched. Where is the problem, therefore? I remember last year, I was in Uganda. And while in Uganda, I talked about a corruption, and a gentleman rose from the floor and said that he disagreed with me, that there is nothing like corruption in Africa. And I was taken aback. He said, no, what is in Africa is looting. And he said corruption presupposes some intelligence in execution of the theft, but that what is happening in Africa is looting, and we celebrate the looters. I was in Liberia, and a Liberian called Boima Fanbule also contradicted me, and I talked about theft. He told me there is no theft in Africa. There is theft on an industrial scale. That is what we are talking about. It cannot be denied, therefore, that corruption has undermined this continent in a big way. We cannot, in Africa, feed ourselves. Yet we say that agriculture is the backbone. And if you go to any African country, almost without exception, the Minister for Agriculture must be a multi-millionaire. We do not have roads to talk about in many of our countries. And if you talk about the Minister for Transport, the minister is a multi-millionaire. We have budgets for Ministry of Health. But if you go to any African country, our presidents and our ministers have no faith in those institutions. Unless they are suicidal, they'll never go to hospitals in their own country. They never. These are indices of underdevelopment because the men and women that we have entrusted with political power, with our active support, have chosen to use public office for personal benefit. So in order to tackle the subject of corruption, the first place where we must do some work is in our politics. Once politics is corrupt, you cannot eliminate corruption. Today in Africa, if you want to be immune from prosecution, you become a politician. Today in Africa, if you want to become wealthy without working very hard, you go into politics. Today in Africa, if you want to do anything with impunity, you become a politician. So that your typical African politician goes into politics not to improve the quality of the lives of the people by using the resources that have been collected by the people, but for personal benefit. The tragedy is that it is we who are here who have gone to school. The problem of Africa are not our mothers and sisters and daughters who are in rural Africa. It is you and me who have gone to school, whose appetite has been sharpened for good things. We are the thieves wherever we are. We are the ones who want good cars. We are the ones who want good houses. We are the ones who want to go on the holidays. We are the ones who want to keep money in Europe and America. We are the thieves. And therefore, if we are to change, it must begin with us. If it doesn't begin with us, then we are going nowhere. And I want to submit to us that we can have many seminars. We can have many workshops on a daily basis. And there is no shortage of workshops and seminars. A Japanese friend of mine once told me he has never seen a continent where people are constantly on workshops and seminars and symposias and colloquias like there is in Africa. I'm submitting to us that we perhaps must now ask ourselves that the resolutions that we have made, how can we implement them? This is the question. There is no dispute, and we have had many presentations, and you'll hear many presentations on the impact of corruption in the education sector, in the health sector, in the agriculture sector, in the infrastructure sector, in all sectors and in every other sector, because we have chosen the path of doing things that undermine the continent of Africa. You know, and I'm acutely aware that this is a conference of women, but permit me to be uncharitable to women a little. There was a time, and I still believe, that women do better in matters of integrity. But in the recent past, we have seen in a number of countries that somehow even women, when they get into the political arena, they get poisoned. We have seen this in Nigeria, I will not name names. We have seen this in Malawi, we will not name names. We have seen this in South Africa, I will not name names. We have seen this in Zambia, I will not name names. We have seen this in many countries, which suggests to me that what we must sanitize is the political environment. And how can we do it? I think that Africa must go to the basics in terms of looking into cultural aspects of Africa. You know, sometimes, and my duty in many of the conferences that I'm called to is to annoy people, actually. And it is my assumption that I annoy people into anger. Europe and America are very clear on what they want, and they work at it. The Chinese are very clear on what they want, and they work at it. The Arabs are also beginning to be very clear on what they want, and they work at it. I always ask myself, are we Africans clear on what we want? And if we are clear, do we work at it? We know, for example, that women play critical roles, and we have seen this in countries such as Rwanda. When given an opportunity in government, you can see that women have the inclination to do that which is right. It is a maternal instinct which works well. But the African electorate is also still a prisoner of patriarchal instincts, and politics has been made corrupt. What is it then that women can do in order to contribute in the fight against corruption? Can they use the position that they occupy, and how can they use the positions? We talked about impunity. Part of the reason why corruption thrives in Africa is because corruption pays. Last week, a thief in Kenya who earns no more than $1,000 was acquitted by the Kenyan courts. Yet he had assets which were nearly $30 million. He was too rich to be convicted. The question is, how can you as women who are the custodians of your houses and institutions, what can you do? At one time, I used to be the director of the Kenya Anti-Corruption Authority, and one of the tricks that men used when they were in government is that when they acquire property in an improper manner, they would hide them in the names of their wives. And the wives would gladly have them hidden in their names, using their marital names and their maiden names and the names of their sisters. What can you do in your position to name and shame? What can we do with the religious society? What can pastors do? I heard one pastor say that he is capable of sanitizing any amount of money, however acquired. Can our pastors and religious community participate in the fight against corruption? Because it is also true that in Africa today, what we thought was useful in the fight against corruption, namely naming and shaming, does not work. You name people and they are not ashamed. What do we do in such a situation? I know time is limited, and I want to draw to the conclusion of my presentation by making certain pointed presentations as a way of concluding. Number one, I want to submit to us that Africa has failed to realize our economic potential because our politics is wrong. Because the men and women whom we give the opportunity to serve us enter into political office not with the desire to serve, but with the desire to use their public office for private benefit. Number two, I want to submit to us that those of us who have had the advantage of exposure, that those of us who have had the advantage of joining the professions, whether we are engineers, whether we are lawyers, whether we are doctors, whether we are architects, we have been partners in crime because we participate and we help in sanitizing the works of these individuals. I also want to submit to us as a third thing that in Africa it is not the shortage of laws that stand in the way of the fight against corruption. We have all the laws that we require, but the will to fight corruption is what is absent. And if you permit me to illustrate, at one time the World Bank thought that if we had very elaborate procurement laws, then that would solve the problem of corruption. I can now confirm to you that corruption, or rather procurement laws, have only served to give a veneer of legality to what is essentially, and this is a contradiction in terms, what is essentially theft in accordance with the law. So that you procure things, it appears to be good on its face, but it offends the law, yet the paper trail looks perfect. Number four, I want to submit to us that because our agenda is controlled from outside of our continent, we are incapable of prioritizing the things that are in our best interest. I'm therefore submitting to us that time has demonstrated that a people will only realize their potential if they are in control over their affairs. I also want to submit to us that as long as Africa is engaged in conflicts of one kind or another, Africa is incapable of marshalling our economic potential, and that we must recognize that some of these conflicts are generated from outside and sustained by us as a means of ensuring that our resources are taken away. I also want to submit to us as a sixth thing that time has come that we must re-examine our education system. Most countries in Africa inherited education systems which were designed, in the words of Carter G. Woodson, to miseducate us. Many Africans, perhaps including us who are here, are miseducated, and that therefore we must re-educate ourselves to ask ourselves what are the values in our cultural practices which are positive. Number 7, we must rearm ourselves morally and ethically. We must ask ourselves what are the good things that we did in our societies which are capable of being anchors as we confront the issues of the 21st century. Number 9, I want to submit to us that we must ask ourselves what we are doing in our institutions of learning. What are we teaching our young men and women? Are they things that are designed to help Africa? We must ask ourselves as a 10th thing, what is the status and nature of our judiciary? Is the judiciary involved in the fight against corruption? Are we reading from the same page? Number 10, which we always don't want to admit, what is the role of ethnicity in the fight against corruption? And Your Excellency, permit me to give this example of a former governor in your own country, and I can quote his name because he was already convicted and he served his term, James Ibori. Nigeria could not convict him. He was convicted in the United Kingdom, and on the day of his release, the people in his village celebrated. He was a thief, but they are thief. We must, as a country, stop owning thieves. We must ensure that we create an environment which is hostile to thieves. Very lastly, how do I think that women can participate in the fight against corruption? It is true that in many countries now where women are occupying their pride of place, such as the Scandinavian countries of Denmark, Norway, Finland, and other countries, whenever women are present and they refuse to be compromised, then they inject some sense of morality in the men. I want to educate the women in this arena. When women are there and they are resolute, even the worst of men will want to look good. Therefore, I'm asking, create an environment which will ensure that your men look good. This thing must be fought at home and even in the bedrooms. Refuse to accept a birthday gift whose source you do not know. And you in the churches, and I say this in all seriousness, and I've said it before, the churches must now begin to question the source of tithes. When people come with 1 million and say that God has blessed them, tell them, blessed you how? And reject. In other words, I'm saying that women and the religious community can be useful in the fight against corruption. Very lastly, I want to submit this, that women must conduct their affairs in a manner that creates an environment where there is unity in purpose. In other words, you must remember that although corruption affects women in a totally different way, you are part of the society. Sometimes I fear, and I've seen this, that women's issues are presented in a conflictual manner rather than in a manner that engenders cooperation. Recruit the men. And when you recruit men and when they are all won over, there is nobody who is as good in fighting the fight of women like the men. I have no doubt in my mind that when a society does not pay regard to its women, that is a society adrift, a giant headed to the rocks. So what is my conclusion? As long as Africa does not combat corruption, Africa will never realize the dividends of Agenda 2063. As long as Africa does not combat corruption, Africa will continue to be a scar on the conscience of the earth. As long as Africa does not fight corruption, we will continue to be seen as children who are children of a lesser God. As long as Africa does not fight corruption, Africa will always be looked upon and will always, as I said, and allow me to repeat, that there are two ways of being at the dinner table of humanity. You are either there as a diner, or you are there as a waiter, or you are there as food to be eaten. Africa, until thus far, has always been at the dinner table of human civilization as a waiter or as food to be eaten. You wait for Davos next week. They'll invite a few African leaders, and you'll only see them on two occasions, when they are taking photos and when they are arriving. And I'm submitting to you that that will continue as long as we don't fight corruption and as long as the women of the species in Africa are not involved in the fight against corruption. I hope that when the heads of state meet here, you'll have a powerful statement to tell them that we have talked enough. Let us now begin to act. I'm aware that I'm not the only panelist here. His Excellency the Ambassador is there. Where I have failed, succeed, Your Excellency. God bless.